There are some aircraft which are justifiably remembered as being ugly. There are some aircraft which are justifiably remembered for being capable. There are some aircraft which manage to both be ugly and absolutely forgettable. And Grumman's addition into this entire group of this collection is the E-1 Tracer. Now, what I found really fun when I was discussing this the other night, I think it was during live last night, but also a few others, is the amount of people who were not quite sure of its A, its heritage, and B, some people who had even forgotten its sister aircraft, or in some ways grandparent aircraft, which had come before it. I'm not surprised. You see, the period we're talking about, the late 1950s, early 1960s, is a period of great change, where you're losing the icons of the World War II era. They're all going off. And you're starting to bring about the icons of the Cold War era. And the aircraft in between, they get lost. They get lost in all the imagery. They get lost in all the effects that's going on. It's something which happens in history. One of the things I often have to deal with as a historian is people trying to categorize you as a revisionist or a modernist or a traditionalist in terms of a historian. I'm not any of those. I'm a contextualist. I'm an accuratist. I.e., what actually happened, not what is the narrative. And you have to remember, the popular narrative, especially when you're dealing with something which is even 10 years later, let alone when you're 50, 60, 100, 80, 100 years later, can be very different than the narrative at the time. Small statements, short periods can be magnified to be descriptions of the entire war. A good example of that is the Mediterranean, which is often summed up as the Battle of Taranto and the Battle of Matapan. Sirte, Cape Bon, all these things get completely forgotten. It's the same when we talk about aircraft in World War II. You know, the aircraft around Midway, around Coral Sea, they're lionized. But a lot of the aircraft, despite having very similar problems which come after them, but which have very similar problems on introduction and very similar reactions as those aircraft did when they came into service, get demonized because that's the period that's remembered. The service afterwards, that's forgotten. Let's put to one side. No. The fact they continue serving and they're still useful and used and crews enjoy them afterwards doesn't matter. And when you're dealing with something as iconic as the Hawkeye, it's very easy for people to think it's always been the Hawkeye. It's always been that aircraft. And I will say that that is a better looking aircraft than the Tracer. I will say the Hawkeye is a much better looking aircraft than the Tracer. But the Tracer is important. It's the starting point of actually proper, decent airborne early warning aircraft. AEW aircraft which weren't, well, to be honest, cobbled together conversions. But this is also a bit of a conversion, but there is a difference. There is a difference. And you'll see when you get to look at it. History is a funny thing in some ways. And naval history is odder than most. In that, in history, it often helps, we can have some fixed points we can focus on and we can go to, and they're geographical constants that we can see and we can use as points of reference. Naval history, most of it takes place far beyond the sights of any civilians, let alone the sight of land. And you can have whole wars which take place on a medium which never stays the same, which is always moving, always changing, and is actually a very real participant in the conflicts itself. It makes it easier, in some regards, for the narrative to skip over parts of the history. And that's where things get really interesting, because the narrative isn't necessarily wrong, but often the narrative is not completely right either. The narrative, because it's seeking to jump on and on and on, can miss a lot of the honestly, jump over a lot of the stuff in between. And that's when you get, I would call them contextualists or accuratist historians, who want to cover the gaps in between, who want to talk about what happens between the narrative coming in. And that's what I like doing with the key aircraft and the key ships and all the videos of my channel. It's not necessarily the most popular approach to take to doing YouTube videos, but I like it because I find a lot of interesting history and a lot of lessons that need to be learned and are too easily forgotten in those bits which are jumped over. I really do. But I do want to give you a warning again. The E-1 Tracer is not a good-looking aircraft, so if you have been eating recently, or eating currently, you might want to pause this video and come back later. It's not really something you want to have your first glimpse of on a full stomach. Just giving you a heads up. Shameless book plug. Now, I do this in every single video. I do this in every video because of a very simple reason. I am a naval historian, and as a naval historian who teaches at universities, I have a small issue. You get hired, you get promoted, based not on your ability to teach, and sadly not on your YouTube videos, even if you do compile them together and hand them in as some sort of, as someone suggested, which I've considered a very clever idea, but no, again, they still don't consider them because they aren't yet found a place for in the current research framework that university funding is decided upon in the UK. I'm not sure about the US and Australia and other places of whether they've managed to include YouTube videos and outreach in their research evaluation of their academics. But as in the UK, where I am far more familiar with it, every university I've had a discussion with, their interpretation of the research frameworks are that it has no impact, bearing, or consideration. The way, therefore, you get a job is based on where your journal articles are published and how many books you sell. Journals are, you do your best and then you cross your fingers and you wait for them to actually publish them. Even once you're through the joys of the review process, and the peer review process can go on for years, you have to wait for them to actually have a slot they can publish it in, so that can be years added on to waiting for it to be published, and this is in history journals. So that can be a very long time coming. So therefore, the only real thing I can impact to actually have a chance of, I don't know, pushing my academic career forward and maybe getting some sort of teaching, permanent teaching role instead of just contract roles, is book sales. Currently I have one book available. It's on a second edition, and that's thanks to all of you purchasing it. But if you haven't and you're interested, it's about destroyers. It's about the genesis of modern destroyer in the Royal Navy. It's Tribals, Battles and Darings, and I consider it a very cool book. And it is a book which I specifically designed and wrote with the idea that even people with no knowledge could pick it up and find it could follow it and have all the information in there, and people with knowledge could go in there and find bits that they hopefully didn't know and find a lot interesting. It was an interesting task. I still remember some of the comments I received of going, "Why did you explain the radar systems? We all know the radar systems." And I was sort of going, not everyone does know the radar system. So yes, I did explain the radar systems in there. But there are also people who commented things of, I didn't realise that was why they had the guns. I didn't realise they had a fire control system on destroyers, and I thought that was something you just had on capital ships. And so it's a fun book, and I like it. I do. Anyway, that out of the way, let's talk about another form of Genesis. So, I've given you a picture of the one which was the testing version from the back. This is not the full version. But it starts off with the S-2 Tracker, anti-submarine warfare aircraft, which is introduced in 1954, and it was the first purpose-built single airframe anti-submarine warfare aircraft to enter service with the USN for aircraft carriers. And it's capable. It really is. The US Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, the Royal Australian Navy, and the Argentine Navy, I think it's still active service with the Argentines. I'm not 100% sure on that one. The reason I say I'm not 100% sure is because the Argentines occasionally have an interesting relationship with what's in service versus what is sitting operating on the side. I think the Brazilians might also have some, so there are options. Because it was a very good, reliable aircraft, it was very, very capable, and they built nearly 1,300 of them. So this was probably one of the better anti-submarine warfare aircraft that ever entered service. An interesting conversation is someone was saying, well, I know about the S3 Viking. I don't know. I think they skipped the S2, and I heard that in the live chat, and I was going to respond, but I got distracted by something else and other questions. And the thing that went from my head was, no, there was the Tracker, and this is where this comes from. The Tracker is what produces first the Trader, and the Trader is basically the US Navy going, we need a carrier onboard delivery aircraft. We need something to provide us with the ability to deliver supplies, mail, all sorts of things to carriers on station. Primarily this was during the Vietnam War, but also other scenarios. They did a lot of work with them. They felt that they were a useful system to support operations. And again, they built nearly 90 of them. They introduced in service in 56. They are serving till 1988. And these aircraft are critical to the growth in at-sea operations. They even were used for testing the insertion of recon marines by parachute from them. They did all sorts of random things with these aircraft. And then, finally, after that's been around for a while, the US Navy's going, well, we've already got these aircraft in service. We would like this idea. We've already been developing these aircraft. We would like an airborne early warning aircraft. We would like something which is going to provide us with the ability to detect a large volume of threats over the horizon, because the Earth is round. I'm sorry if anyone finds this disturbing and as a concept, but I'm going to explain it quite simply. The US Navy at the same point as this were trying the idea of a SSRN, a nuclear-powered submarine called Triton, armed with a massive radar. Their idea was that would be the picket vessel for a carrier battle group. But it still came with the trouble of the curvature of the Earth, because it was on the Earth and therefore horizon. And the fact is, the submarine's lower even than the destroyers. Certainly lower than the carrier. Its horizon is actually therefore higher. And its view is that much shorter at low altitude. For aircraft at low altitude. And that's the big threat, always. The big threat is aircraft or missiles or systems. hiding high up in the atmosphere. And if they're going fast high up in the atmosphere, that is easy to spot, and something you can spot, you can get a target solution on, and you can intercept, and you can take out. The problem will always be weapon systems which are hugging the Earth, which are napping the Earth, because they're coming round the curvature of the Earth. This is where the airborne early warning aircraft really came in, because they were able to go up to a far higher altitude, and their radar could look down. And so instead of them having the curvature of the Earth curving away from them, the curvature of the Earth, if you're up here, helps you, because it almost lets you look slightly further. If you think about it, on this distance, if it was flat, here, I'd have this area. But if it's curved, I have this area. Now, 100% like that, but it does help. And that's the reality. So again, the US Navy builds 90 of these aircraft. 90 of them. And they are a design challenge, because no one has built before something which was a specialist airborne early warning aircraft. In fact, you can tell from their number designations that these are the first aircraft built as specialists in their roles. Their aircraft have been used in these roles, yes, but they haven't been developed as specialists in these roles. The S-2 Tracker, well, that's not the first of its generation. But the Trader and the Tracer, they are. Today's video is about the Tracer. Today's video is about that airborne early warning aircraft. But believe me, I will be getting to the ASW aircraft. It's just, I'm honestly deciding whether it's... I think it probably is something I have to do to GAN it first, because that provides a baseline for reference of what I'm going to be discussing when I talk about the American aircraft. Because otherwise they can just, because they are so unique, there's no real comparisons to some of their capabilities in terms of carryability they provide. It can just seem like a unique capability and not be put in proper context. So I think I need to do the GAN it first before I get into the Tracker and the Viking. I think that makes sense. Now, one of the interesting things about this aircraft is it has to go with stow folding wings. Now, I wanted to put this picture in because this is a beautiful picture to me. It's a picture, of course, of Grumman Wildcats, the F4F, and they were the first aircraft to have a stow folding wing. And the reason they have a stow folding wing is they're designed for Royal Navy carriers, and Grumman developed this because, of course, the Wildcats, they were trying to sell them to the US Navy, but the US Navy wasn't taking them. The French put in an order, then the French, of course, fall, and the British take over the order, and the British basically go, we like these aircraft, we really do, but we need them to have their wings fold, because their wings couldn't fold at the time, to fit in our carriers. And of course the British carriers are ever so slightly shorter in height than the American carriers. When I say ever so slightly, I'm talking about a couple of feet here, so I'm being kind of generous. And, well, the Grumman designers went, our wings always do that when we make them fold. That won't fit. Okay, so let's do this. We have an idea. Instead of having them do this, instead of... Can I do this in my hands? I used to be able to do this with my hands, so let's see if we can still do it. Okay, I'm going to make so I have more space to do it in, I'm going to do this. So, your wings are, let's say, like this. Going to have to do it from this angle. And they do this instead. So instead of going up, or, other options, they do this. Which is a very, very cool system. It's not quite the same system as the British used on the Fulmars and a few of the other aircraft they had at the time. So that sometimes causes people to get into all sorts of debates of whether this is actually no, this is a system which the British used on the full mast. It's not the same system. They have a slightly different ideas about it, and there's nothing wrong with that. You know, that there are many different types of wing folding. It's one of those interesting things that even different manufacturers would often have different types of wing folding in their structure. For example, the full miles ones, the wings literally do that. That's how they design the struts of their aircraft. That's what the wings can support and are shaped around. The Wildcats, Grumman go differently. The thing that's really interesting is that when you get on to the large aircraft which Grumman were designing for these carrier operations, they immediately go, well, hang on, we need to be able to take up less space. And they bring this back. So, the Wildcats, the genesis, really, of Grumman's dominance as a naval aviation company, as a company which produces excellent naval aviation aircraft, almost has an homage paid to it in all these successive aircraft. And that carries on today. The Hawkeye and the Greyhound both still use the same system. I thought you'd find that interesting. Anyway, here are the vitals of what we're talking about today. Here are the vitals of the Tracer. And it's a cool aircraft. But as said, it is not a beautiful aircraft. And it is definitely, when you look at the photos, the drawings don't do it justice. When you do the photos, it does look, there is something wrong. Just wrong. It has better and it has worse angles. It does. So, now its wingspan is 72 foot 4 inches, which is over double that of its contemporary fighter aircraft, the F4D1. And I know there are going to be some people who are going to go, well, Alex, that's the Phantom. No, it's the Phantom's wingspan is bigger than that. You know, what are you talking about? No, that is not the F4D1. The Phantom is not. Its wingspan is 38 foot 5 inches for starters, but I'm not talking about the Phantom. I'm talking about another aircraft which likes to get written out of history a little bit. And I can understand why. It doesn't, get the joyous things that happen for other aircraft. It doesn't get the same attention. It doesn't get the same service because of the period it comes in and because of the type of aircraft it is. But there you go. That's what we call the F4D Skyray. And, well, honestly, I probably shouldn't admit this, but I've been known to use pictures of that aircraft in quizzes with students as the bonus question round to if I've got multiple groups of students who are doing very well in a pop quiz about naval aviation history, and I go, right, here's this aircraft. If you can identify it, you win the round, because currently you're all tied. And I've heard some really interesting answers in my time. But yeah, the fighter we're talking about for this period when they're entering service is the Skyray. And then the Phantom, well, that does come into service, but that isn't introduced into service till 1960. And doesn't really roll out in full force till, well, it's introduced into service in December 1960, so it's really not fully in service and fully integrated till about late 1961. It takes about a year to 2 years to transition. So for most of this period, the fighter we're talking about when they're starting off, when they're coming to service, when they're doing the testers, what they're coordinating and organising with is the Skyray. The F4D Skyray. Which, again, is made by Douglas. It's the last pure Douglas aircraft before they become the McDonnell Douglas aircraft. And if I really want to occasionally wind up some people, I might point out it looks quite like some modern aircraft. In fact, if you want to look at it and this is not the question for today's video, but if you want to below, try and sort of look at this picture. I'm going to increase its size so you can see it bigger. Try and think what modern aircraft it reminds you of in shaping and design, because there are a few. And I would say it's one of the most pugnacious looking jet fighters. It's up there with the de Havilland Vampire and a few others for me, in that it just looks like it's, I am here. You are not going to enjoy this. But it's a good aircraft. It's a very good aircraft, but it's completely forgotten. It's one of those things which gets written out so quickly and so easily from naval history. A lot of these discussions get completely ignored, principally because they don't have... It doesn't have anything to set it apart in history. It doesn't manage to be a key part of Vietnam. That's the Phantom. It doesn't get to go on to do all the things the Phantom does. And it's entered service in 1956, so it's too late for the Korean War. It's just sitting there. It's in service 1956 till 1964. And there's only a little over 400 made, so it doesn't get the same attention. But compared to that aircraft, this is massive in wingspan. Lengthwise, though, it's 45 foot 3 inches for the F4D Skyray. It's 45 foot 3 inches for the Tracer. So, not that big a difference. I'm told by some that an inch makes a massive amount of difference. But I think myself, when we're talking about an aircraft on an aircraft carrier, I'm dealing with hangar space, a single inch is not going to make anybody's life all that much easier. It really isn't. Not when you're dealing with something which is that long. But still, it helps it store itself out, and when you combine that with a little over 3,000 horsepower when it's taking off, thanks to its two engines, you can start to see its operating characteristics come through. Now, I would say, as I always do when I'm dealing with modern aircraft, I have checked the stats, and this does count as modern aircraft because it's since 1950. Now, some channels, including my good friend Naval, who's a Shipshape crew member with me, and Bilge Pump's crew member with me. We spend far too much of our lives talking to each other. He stops his channel at 1950 because he doesn't want to get into the issues of missiles, and he doesn't want to get into the issues of disclosure and dealing with occasionally the potential for knocks on the door and things like that, because you've discussed something which can get you into trouble. I do this rule, as I've said in our videos, but I always have to reiterate when I'm talking about anything which is post 1950, because I follow the rule. I get the stats out of a book, but I check the stats with the stats available on Wikipedia to check they are all public domain information. I check my view is, if it's on Wikipedia and it's sourced on Wikipedia, then that's it. No one can argue it's not already public information, and that is the public information perception of those stats. And the analysis is all my own work. So if I happen to crack onto something through that analysis, which I'm not supposed to, I'm sorry. Maybe the secrets are not that mind-bendingly complicated. But leaving that to one side, she has a fairly good cruise speed, and the service ceiling was 15,800 feet, according to the stats, compared to the service ceiling for the F4D1, the Skyray, which was 55,000 feet. I would mention that those stats also are corroborated by the National Naval Aviation Museum, which is part of the Naval History and Heritage Command of the US Navy. So, they are there, 15,800 foot. That might seem rather low altitude for something which is an airborne early warning aircraft, but that is the official listed figure. I would say there's a dispute between the History Navy Command and some other sources, and what's on Wikipedia, of the top speed. Maximum speed is listed as 238 miles per hour at 4,000 feet, but the Naval Heritage Command listed at 227 miles per hour at 4,000 feet. There's also a dispute over whether the range was 1,000 miles exactly or 1,035 miles. Honestly, in the scheme of things, that really doesn't matter. What we can say with absolute certainty about this aircraft is it's useful. It is what allows the US Navy to really start developing the idea of airborne early warning, of forward air control, and that's thanks to its radar especially. Its radar is a really interesting system because it is one of the first radars, which uses and this is the Hazeltine AN/APS 82. Now, it had an airborne moving target indicator that would use video of previous pulse next to the current pulse. So it would allow you to distinguish, hopefully, a flying aircraft by showing a pulse which is moving. This helps especially when you're dealing with clutter. Now, clutter is often reflections from all sorts of things in the atmosphere which can affect radar, but it also can be reflections from the ocean, which is just moving around. It can be reflection from rocks. It can be reflection from all sorts of random things can actually cause a radar reflection. Just bouncing off submerged rocks can actually cause radar reflections on occasion with certain types of radar. So one of the ways you can filter things out is you can go, well, hang on, I've got previous pulses, and I'm comparing previous pulses with current pulses, and if they ain't moving, they ain't showing up. Aircraft, well, when they are moving, the energy from them changes position. It's a constant change of reflection and position, and so that means that the moving object can be separated from the stationary background. And again, I'm being very careful to pretty much read from the official description of that radar and that system. Testing, though, started to reveal very quickly that with the ability to see 250 to 300 miles around them, again, official figures, they could really help CAPS provide a coverage and protection for their carriers, and could really help their carrier groups operate with a buffer zone of safety, and more importantly, push out the safe zone. And if you can push out the CAP envelope, you can push out the anti-submarine warfare envelope, because you can have the aircraft operating further from the task group with the knowledge that they are secure because they are still within the CAP bubble. It's amazing how things can become a lot easier the further you can push out your rings of defense in terms of fleet operations, because the further you can see, the further you can secure in terms of your area of operations and your fleet's operation security. And that gives you depth to intercept and engage enemy threats. This is a key enabler of that. And it gets even better as it goes into the Vietnam War, because during the Vietnam War they get up to a lot of very interesting things. They really do. Their deployments started with the Constellation, the CVA-64, in 1960. And they deployed roughly 56 deployments in support of Vietnam. Their primary role when they were doing the Vietnam operations was airborne early warning, but also strike coordination. Now, they do strike coordination in a very, very clever way, because instead of just simply providing an organizer for the strike, they can fly with the strike and provide that strike with knowledge of MiGs coming in to intercept them, can provide that strike with targeting vectors, and can control other aircraft to support them. So you can use this one aircraft to coordinate a far larger picture, and it therefore can extend the reach and engagement of the carrier that much further. Because it's sort of almost like you're deploying a mini carrier forward. You're still using your main carrier for providing the aircraft, etc. But this goes forward and is coordinating the strikes in real time in that area. And providing those strikes with the ability to go, oh, there are MiGs coming to intercept me. Oh, good, we're ready for you. And it's all thanks to their early warning radar, to their ability to see their targets. Now, as you can imagine, something which proves quite so useful, and something proves quite so capable, is quickly they're going, hang on, we need to replace this. We need to get something better than this. And that's where, of course, the Hawkeye development comes in. But that doesn't mean this wasn't a good aircraft for the time it was in. In fact, for most of its operations from 1958 to 1977, nearly 20 years, they are rated very, very useful by all forces which use them. And the E-2 Hawkeye does start to come in service in the mid-1960s. So that's a transition of nearly a decade, in fact a little bit over a decade, before they're completely out of service, because they are useful. Their actual final cruise was on board the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt. That, of course, was a Midway-class carrier. And again, this shows the ability of aircraft carriers to transition. Because, if you think about that carrier, Midway-class carrier starts out World War II. That's what she's designed for, the aircraft of that generation. And then, by the time she's finishing off her service, by the time she's ending her service, she has aircraft which, let's be honest, the admirals in World War II, if you'd offered them this in exchange of a limb, they'd have gone, which one? Think about this aircraft, the Tracer, in World War II. It really does look like someone's given it put a bad haircut on it, doesn't it? Or something. I'm not sure what, but it's just... yeah. If someone saw that flying at the right angle, I could imagine them going, it's got to be a flying saucer. Anyway. This aircraft, imagine it in World War II. Imagine the capability of something which can see 250 to 300 miles. Officially. In World War II. Operating from carriers. And before you turn around and go, well, actually, which carriers could operate them in World War II? Well, you have a good point. They could probably operate from most of the American carriers. Their lifts are deck edge. These are tail dragger aircraft, so the weight is positioned right that you could probably do something. You could probably get them and use the lifts quite easily to get them up and down, and they do fold up very nice and neatly, and they do fit inside the hangars, so yes. British carriers, if you want to see a rapid conversion of Royal Navy carrier design, you put this thing in front of them and go, but you can't fit it right now. The Royal Navy carriers will grow deck edge lifts faster than you can say yippee-ki-yay. I mean, it is a capability which transforms naval warfare. And these days, it's of course associated constantly with its successor. It is constantly associated with its successor, the Hawkeye. But it all starts with the Tracer. It all starts with the capability of the Tracer. It all starts with that being, in many ways, developed for a scenario which was post-Korean War, looking at the growing threat of the Soviet Navy, looking at the growing missile threat, thinking about World War II style operations, and then you get Vietnam. And Vietnam is an absolute baptism in fire, But whereas you get the cool images of the Phantoms doing all the jobs they do in Vietnam and being this synonymous aircraft with the 1960s America and the growth of naval aviation capabilities, this aircraft has its role is sitting back. It's supporting everyone. It's coordinating everyone. And that means it gets forgotten. It does. That doesn't matter in a way. Grumman never built their aircraft, although many of them did become legendary, for the purposes of being famous aircraft. They built them to be good aircraft. That is the great thing about Grumman as an aviation company. They're reliable. They are a constant, as their heritage has shown. They produce pugnacious aircraft as a rule. Aircraft which look often more engine than they look aircraft. But they're robust, and they do the job required. I have to say, with this aircraft, I really do like the fact, though, that it came from an anti-submarine warfare aircraft, a carrier-on-board delivery aircraft, and this. And I think that's, again, something we've sort of forgotten. You produce a very good, very solid airframe, especially a larger airframe, like a larger ship, and you can adapt it to many roles. You can adapt it to all to the operations you need it to. And the fact that one aircraft could go through all those roles, it shows the utility of the airframe. It really does. Anyway, today's question, and I always do finish videos with a question. I would say the airborne moving targeting indicator and that system is probably what sets the radar aboard the tracer apart. And whilst I would love to say, what do you think would have happened? How do you think a tracer being present in World War II would have affected World War II? I think I've pretty much already answered that. This kind of capability on the carriers would change naval aviation considerably. The fact that you probably also have a land-based variant, which would also change things, would change up warfare massively in terms of scope of engagements, and would probably have led to an even more interesting and robust development of naval aviation capacities on both sides, and anti-aircraft capacities on both sides during World War II, because airborne early warning can work both ways. It can be both the sword and the shield, as the tracer was. So that would have been interesting. But I think the more interesting question, and the question which we should probably consider, is if you have the moving target indicator system, comparing a previous pulse to the reflection that's currently being received. With that in mind, the question becomes, what happens if that technology, the ability to filter for moving targets from radar clutter, comes into service? It wouldn't be in 1939, that would be instantaneously with war beginning, but there are capabilities of that technology, I would argue, that could have meant it could have, if someone had been very lucky, i.e. if Britain and America had fused that technology and both been equally lucky at some point, have come into service roughly 1943. Probably shipborne rather than airborne, considering the likely weight of any solution. But what do you think that would have happened? What do you think that kind of system, as part of shipborne radar, that would allow them to distinguish flying aircraft more easily from clutter, and therefore even from the clutter you get at horizon level? So it doesn't extend your horizon, but it does mean your horizon doesn't have quite as large a fuzzy area and fuzzy edge as it's sometimes explained as. what do you think happens? What do you think how do you think that affects the course of World War II? And I am going to emphasize the Allies as the most likely recipient. If you want to consider it about the Axis forces, you're more than welcome to, but honestly, with the resources available to them, the research capacities available to them, and the sheer abilities to get actually access to materials available to them, I think it's far more likely the Allies achieve it than the Axis forces. But again, I will leave it up to you, and I'll be highly interested in what you say. What have we got coming up next? Well, next week we have World War II Carrier Naval Aviation Doctrine pre-War II War. And that's going to be a fun one because, as I explained in a live, and I've explained in a little short video on Patreon, that is an interesting scenario, and the US are probably the only nation in the world which develops both two doctrines of carrier aviation and two doctrines of land-based naval aviation. Those doctrines being for land-based aviation being the US Navy and the US Coast Guard, which both have similar but also different methodologies of how they're going to patrol and carry out long-range aviation over the sea. And on the carrier, it's the US Marines and the US Navy, and they have again different doctrines. And those, okay, yes, they do fuse them into one grand doctrine, but recognizing these disparate strands of the doctrine development within it as its foundations allows you to examine it in all its contrast and kind of beauty, as it's a fusion far more than any other nation. The US really does benefit from that. You know, I always pride myself on giving an honest perspective in terms of what my honest opinion is. So if I don't like something, I'll say it. If I do like something, I'll say it. Whereas, to an extent, the IJN and IJA's relationship in terms of aviation is destructive. And in Britain, I would argue that due to the artificial division achieved by the formation of the Royal Air Force dividing the Fleet Air Arm off from the fleet, caused it doesn't really cause it to be impeded, because the Royal Navy very much develops the observers to provide that theoretical base, but it causes a very different perception of aviation development. Because if you think about it, in the other nations, pilots are at the front of the development. They're the pilots are for it. Whereas for the Royal Navy, in terms of naval aviation doctrine development and its ideas, it's the observers. So they're doing navigation and emphasizing their role and capabilities, and it doesn't really surprise you, therefore, how much the Royal Navy really does stick, even post-war, to the two-seat option of things, because it's become such a part of their aviation heritage and naval aviation, because the observers were what kept naval aviation doctrine and development alive in many ways in the 1920s and 30s. And that provides a different approach. In the US, it's this fusion that provides the differences and allows them to develop some really interesting ideas, some really terrible ideas, and some really great ideas. And basically, that's just a story of humanity, isn't it? Some really terrible ideas, some really interesting ideas, and some really great ideas. The trick is always, as ever, to work out which of those ideas is which, and often we can't tell till hindsight. Anyway, until next time, I hope you enjoyed, and thank you for watching. Take care. Please, if you like the video, please like, maybe share, subscribe. That's all very helpful and very kind to me. It helps me grow the channel and reach more people with naval history. And that is the aim of the channel. Also, the aim of the channel is to get to 15,000 subscribers by 23:50 hours on the 24th of December 2024, so that my aunt and my mother's competition over numbers will finally be over. But we'll leave that to another time, and an explanation to, well, the many videos which have explained that friendly competition going on between my mother and my aunt. They're non-identical twins. I will leave it at that. Take care, everyone. Thank you for watching.